Hey girl, hey, and welcome to the Self Love Fix podcast where we get relatable, we share tea, and we support each other on this journey of self love, self worth, personal development, self esteem, and self care. Because why wait until it's too late to start becoming the best version of ourselves? Let's start today. And I'm your host, Beatrice. So let's get into it. Hello, hello, hello. How are you doing this week? I hope you're doing well. So last week we talked about self-forgiveness as a form of self-care, which was part one of the 3-part series. And this week is going to be part 2. So I hope last time, the episode gave you some insight into the theme we have going on here, which is, just unconventional forms of self-care. So before I dive in, I do want to say thank you for everyone who's been rating and reviewing. I will say we've had a little bit of a slowdown from rates and reviews over the past couple of weeks. So if you could take a couple seconds to go and leave an actual review so I can see what you guys are thinking. So I know if this is actually helping you. So I know if this is benefiting you. Because if I'm not hearing from you guys, I have no idea if this is worth your time or if the things I'm talking about is, helping you out. Cause that's what the whole point of this is to help you become kind of like the greatest version of yourself. To help you learn that you have the tools and the ability to become the greatest version of yourself is what I should say. But yeah, diving back into it, this week we are getting into part 2 of the series, and part 2 is all about boundaries. Yes, boundaries. I know we all are about that these days. And I think that a lot of us are aware of the importance of boundaries and what it means for our lives, but a lot of us don't really know how to implement it. A lot of us don't really know where to put a boundary, when we need to have a boundary, that kind of a thing. And a lot of us don't even know what are boundaries. So let's start there. I like to think of boundaries the same way that Miss Iyanla Van Zant defines boundaries. And she says that boundaries are where you end and where I begin. And I don't know if Iyanla Van Zant actually came up with that definition, but either way, it's a really simple way to look at a very important concept. I think sometimes the lines get blurred between our own comfort zones and someone else's comfort zone, as in sometimes we either don't know when something someone else does makes us uncomfortable, or sometimes we are afraid to let someone else know that what they do makes us uncomfortable. So here's like some lighthearted examples. Like, how many times have you had one of your family members ask you where your significant other is in front of everyone, or ask you in front of everyone why you decided to make the career change that you made? And then you felt that feeling of uncomfortableness. I'm not sure which one the word is, but you felt that feeling of discomfort. Discomfort. Yes, that's what I was trying to say. Where your stomach drops, or almost that feeling of embarrassment. So what do? You probably usually giggle and play it off and say something witty, and then hope that the humor will dissipate your feeling of discomfort. But does it? Does it? I think that when it comes to boundaries, so many of our boundaries get violated day by day that it's really hard to keep up with. And I don't know about you, but I used to not notice when someone was violating my boundaries until they had done it so many times that I ended up addressing it when it was too late. So let's go back to what I said about boundaries being where you begin and where I end, using the example of your nosy auntie asking why you don't have a man's yet. So your aunt feels totally comfortable with asking you that invasive question, and she sees nothing wrong with it, right? But you, however, are not comfortable with this question. And you know this because of that feeling of slight embarrassment or irritation that arises. So where you end is that you don't want to talk about your romantic life with your aunt. And where your aunt begins is that she desires to know about her niece's romantic life. But what happens when you suppress that feeling of embarrassment or irritation is you're sacrificing your self-care, because saying no or not engaging in something you don't want to engage in is absolutely a form of self-care. Honoring where you end and where someone else begins is self-care. I remember one time I had a family member who asked if I could watch her child the next morning on really short notice, as in she'd asked me the night before. But I had already had plans, and even though she was family and she really needed the help, I had to think about my own priorities and prior engagements. And if this was back when I used to have difficulty understanding where someone else ends and where I begin, the thoughts that would have popped up in my head would have been things like, oh no, if I don't babysit, she'll be upset with me. Or, should I babysit? Can I maybe move my schedule around? Like, who else is going to do this if I don't do this? But notice how all these questions all revolve around me trying to look outside of myself to come up with a decision for someone else. See how that blurs the lines of where you end and where someone else begins? Or where, in this case, where I end and where someone else begins? Luckily, at that time, I knew how to look inward to be able to make a decision, and I set a boundary. I told that family member I won't be able to babysit. I actually have plans in the morning. Now, in that situation, my family member said, that's okay, I'll find somebody else. But that's not always the case, right? We sometimes face backlash or pushback when we set boundaries. In fact, we often face backlash and pushback when we set boundaries. But the key is to remember that how other people respond or react to our boundary setting is none of our business. Sometimes people don't like boundaries. Sometimes they take it as a personal rejection. Sometimes they get upset because boundaries make them feel they have a lack of control. Whatever it is, it's not yours to deal with. It could be one of a million reasons, and you could spend ages trying to figure out why they're upset with you for establishing your boundary. Or you can acknowledge and affirm that you deserve to set a boundary, whether or not people are happy about it. You can affirm and acknowledge that this is a form of your self-care. So one of the ways I routinely establish a boundary is that after work, I don't answer phone calls or texts or anything on my phone for an hour during dinner time. Or like I should say on days that I work. This is kind of confusing, but on days that I work, I usually have dinner like almost right after getting home from work. So within that hour of having dinner, I don't answer any phone calls or texts or anything on my phone. And to me, I spend so much of my time at work communicating with other people and sending emails and texting and making calls that I find that I need that hour to myself, and I need an hour to be present with the food I'm eating or to be present with whatever show I'm watching, because I know I deserve uninterrupted quality time with myself. I'm really big on that. That's a big form of self-care for me, is quality time with myself. Like, that I can't compromise, right? And sometimes this makes my family members upset when they have something really important to tell me, but I really don't budge. Like, that phone is going on silent. I will, what do you call that? That thing with the little half moon, that crescent moon, that do not disturb. I will hit that for that, my entire 1 hour little dinner block time. And I don't have an issue with not answering my phone for an hour, but they might. Meaning that's something they have to deal with and they have to learn to adapt to, because it is my boundary for them. It is where I draw the line, and the choice is theirs whether or not they want to cross that line or stay behind it. Now, speaking of cross that line, you might be wondering about those people who do cross your boundaries and don't respect your boundaries even when you establish them. Like, you might be saying to yourself, well, what do I do then? Well, firstly, I would say when the boundary is crossed, do you introduce a consequence? Because if you don't introduce a consequence to the person that you gave a boundary to, they will like think to themselves, okay, she wasn't really that serious about this. So I guess since she let me do it, I'll just keep doing it. It's kind of like when you're a kid and your parent says no cookies until after dinner, but then you like sneak one, and all your parent does when they catch you sneaking it or sneaking the cookie behind their back is like make a deep sigh and don't even really do anything. I mean, what do you do then? You're probably going to get another cookie, probably even 10 cookies, because you're like, well, they're not even really tripping about me getting this cookie, so let me just, let me just go snatch some more. Well, it's the same way with adults, unfortunately. It's the same exact way. So, like, I remember this one time I dated this guy, and in the beginning, he would make jokes that I found to be really offensive, and I would let him know that I didn't like those jokes. But when he continued to do it, I didn't actually set a consequence. So what did he do? He continued to make the jokes. Then one day I realized, no, wait, this is actually a boundary for me. I don't like these jokes, and I'm going to let him know that if he doesn't stop cracking these jokes, this dating thing, it's not going to work out. And I mean, it was that bad. Granted, it was really early on, so it made sense to kind of make such a drastic thing of, I'm not going to talk to you anymore if you keep making these jokes, because it was pretty early on. And so the next time that he did make the joke or make those jokes, I told him how I felt. And at first he wasn't apologetic. He was not. And so because of that, I didn't respond to his messages or his calls going forward. So as you can see, I followed through on my consequence by not responding to him after having once again making those offensive jokes. Now, eventually, he apologized via text profusely, because once again, I wasn't picking up his phone calls. And he expressed that he would no longer make the jokes, and it took me some time, but I gave him one more chance to prove himself. And I gave him the chance to prove himself as a friend, because at that point, he lost the privilege of like being able to date me or being able to know me in that way because of just the way he treated me. I was like, I told you several times not to do this, and then you kept doing it. So I was like, okay, I could be your friend and we'll see, if you're actually going to follow through on what you say, which is not making those offensive jokes. And you know what? He actually did. He actually followed through, and he no longer made the jokes from that day forward. And so as you can see, it's not enough to state a boundary. Like, you have got to follow through. The follow through or the establishment of a consequence, or both really, is the key component of the boundary process. But also remember to have grace with people when you first introduce a boundary, as in you don't want to tell someone right off the bat something along the lines of, I don't know, don't use my straightener without asking. If you do, I won't ever let you near my beauty products going forward. Like, we don't want to do that. We want to give people time to get used to a new boundary, because something that is a boundary for you might seem like something that would never be a boundary for someone else. Like, going off the example I just used, maybe you don't like anyone using your things without asking every time, but someone else might be completely okay with anyone using any of their things at any time. So because we all have different boundaries, we want to give each other time to adapt. So maybe we want to say something like, hey, I don't mind you using my straightener, but please ask me first. Then the next time, if they don't ask you first, then you might say something like, hey, I mentioned this last time, and maybe you don't remember me doing so, but I really don't like when people use my things without asking first. So please ask me before you use my straightener. And if a couple times later they're still whiling, using your stuff without asking, you really might want to hit them with that, hey, I've let you know before, I don't like people using my things without asking, so I'm just going to let you know. If you don't ask me next time, you're going to need to find someone else's straightener to borrow. I'm just letting you know. And if they slip again, follow through on your word. Don't let them borrow it. Sometimes consequences are uncomfortable to express, and sometimes follow through is even more uncomfortable. But when you think about it, if you don't do either, you are dishonoring and disrespecting yourself. And once again, you are not giving yourself proper self-care, because once again, we all know that feeling we get when we know we need to set a boundary or a consequence, that feeling of discomfort, that feeling of wrestling with your thoughts of what to do next. Yeah, that. Ignoring that is dishonoring and disrespecting yourself. And ultimately, it's causing yourself to lack in the department of self-care. Don't do that. Honor yourself, set boundaries, take care of yourself, and acknowledge that you deserve to express and establish your boundaries. You deserve to create that space around you for other people to also acknowledge and to also affirm. And if those people around you are not acknowledging and affirming that space you've created for yourself, and when I say space, I mean that the boundaries, because your boundary is your space, right? It's your area. It's where you begin and where someone else ends. And so if people around you are not respecting that, I mean, you got to make that decision of if you really want them around you like that, or if you have to make some more boundaries for how you're going to relate and engage with them. Because again, you deserve to have that be respected and be affirmed and be acknowledged. And that wraps up our episode for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great rest of your week, and I will catch you next time right here on the Self Love Fix.